Welcome back to part 3 on how to install a bike from scratch. With the handlebars installed in part 2, now we're ready to install the brakes, and I prefer to do that before I move on to the drivetrain. For both these bikes, the Kona and the Norco, I'm going to install the Shimano Derailleur XT brakes. These are the new M8000s. I prefer the Shimano brakes because of their reliability and ease of use. They are made in Japan, and they use what's called the servo wave. iSpec 2 allows you to connect the shifter to them, and these are brakes for cross-country, trail, and all mountain, as you can see it's specified here. This is what's called the post mount, and if you had an older frame that might come with what's called the IS. This is an adapter from that older standard to a post mount. And usually the frame manufacturer will specify clearly the minimum size disc that can be installed on the frame. In my case is 160 millimeters, so I can install the caliper right here with no other adapters. The provided mounting bolts are for situations where you just install the caliper directly onto the frame with no other adapter. Make sure you center the caliper to the disc, and then use a 5mm Allen key just to tighten up the bolts. I have a few videos talking about the Shimano brakes in details, so I'm not going to cover that here, but make sure you follow those links in the description. As you're running the brake hose by the frame, especially if you have a full suspension, make sure you put some protective tape right here, because otherwise that paint is going to rub off rather quickly. Run the brake hose all along the frame. Do the same with the front brake, and you see the hose running nicely here. You have usually one of these clips that keeps it attached to the fork. Then run the hose on the inside of that lower leg, and it's going to bring your caliper right here where my fork has 160 millimeter post mounts. Well, because my disc is 180 millimeter, I'm going to have to install that caliper on top of this adapter. Now, the adapters are provided by the brake manufacturers for specific rotor sizes. This is the Shimano one for 180 millimeters, and the code, you can see it right there on screen. Also, you're going to need these longer screws. Look at the length of those and look at what's provided. Next, I would install the brake levers, and I would prefer to do that with the bike on the ground. This is also the time to shorten the hoses or reverse them if you have to. I've already done that for the Norco. Follow the link on the screen for all the details on how to do it. One last thing before we move on. Many people don't realize that for brake calipers that have this banjo, you can actually loosen up that bolt so you orient the hose whichever way you want it. And you see here on the Norco the extreme angle that was needed for the rear brake hose. And that brings us to the drivetrain. Both of these bikes are getting Shimano Derailleur XT shifters and rear derailleurs. This is an XT GS or medium cage 11 speed. Same with the shifter. The chains that I'm using are going to be SRAM. So Kona's getting the 11 speed, Norco's getting the 12 speed GX. The cranks that I'm using, one is race face for the Kona 24mm axle, and a SRAM 30mm axle and carbon for the Norco. So as you can see, mixing and matching is really possible when it comes to the drivetrain. And I have a lot of these products covered in different videos, installation videos, detailed ones. I'm going to post them all up and just provide highlights and tips and tricks in this video. First thing, I would install the shifter, and you can see my 11 speed XT here. I'm using what's called the iSpec 2, in which the shifter is attached to the brake lever bar clamp. You can have a discrete one. You see a SRAM shifter here attached with the bar clamp. The equivalent of iSpec for SRAM is called Matchmaker. Also, there are third-party manufacturers that would allow you to actually connect the SRAM to a Shimano and vice versa. The mounting bolts here, put a tiny bit of Loctite on them just so it doesn't come loose from vibration. Obviously, if you install a front shifter, this is the time to do it. And on the handlebar, you usually install the shifter bar clamp first, then the brake lever bar clamp. Use your grip again as a guide for your lever position, because next you're going to have to trim this shifter housing to the right length. Just like we did for the brake hose, imagine that worst case scenario with your handlebars turned all the way, and you want to make sure you still have a kind of loose cable housing over there and not too tight, and then cut it to the appropriate length. If you have a good pair of side cutters, you can use that to trim the housing, but this is one of those where having even a cheaper cable and housing cutter, a dedicated one, would be a good idea. Here we go. And then you gotta make sure that is nice and round. And finish the job with the cable housing and or ferrule. Next we're going to install the rear derailleur. The rear derailleur gets installed onto the rear derailleur hanger, which is specific to each bike and is paramount to have it nice and straight. Also make sure that those retaining bolts are nice and tight and not loose, because otherwise your derailleur is going to start to wobble. If the frame manufacturer specifies direct mount rear derailleur, you have to modify these derailleur to make it work, and I have a video about that. This is a standard mount, and all you need to do in case of this Shimano derailleur is grab a 5mm Allen key, look at that bolt over here, put a bit of grease on it, and I want to draw your attention to this little tab here that's going to mate what Shimano calls the fork, being that other tab on the derailleur hanger. These two have to touch, so in order to make sure of that, just start threading this in. As you get it really close, like here, push down on it, making sure that there is contact between the two, and tighten this up. This is 8 to 10 Newton meters as per Shimano. And now you're able to measure the other end of your cable housing. Make sure you don't have a sharp bend on the housing, and don't leave this too long, because it's going to stick out too far from the frame and get ripped off. Don't forget that cable and or ferrule. Here we go. And at this point you are ready to adjust the high and the low limiter screws. I have to remind you that I have all this covered in a full M8000 installation video, but in a nutshell, the high limiter screw is taking care of the alignment of this jockey with your high gear, which is the smallest cog, and then L or low limiter screw takes care of the alignment of the same jockey with your biggest cog. Turn this barrel adjuster clockwise until it stops, and then undo it a full 2 turns, and you're ready to push that inner cable into the housing. Ensure that the shifter is on the last gear here. Then put a bit of tension on the cable and tighten it up. Next I'm going to install the cranks. The race face will go onto the Kona and the XO1 on the Norco. Just make sure you follow the manufacturer's instructions on how to do it for each type. Because the installation is fairly specific, I'm going to do separate videos and put up the links for them. For the race face, just fit in the non-drive side, then the drive side goes onto that spline, and tighten up this bolt to anywhere between 50 and 60 Newton meters. At the end of the installation, always pull on the cranks a little bit, make sure that there is no side-to-side play. Also spin them to see if they move freely. It's normal for newly installed cranks to be a bit stiff. They will loosen up after a few rides. Also at this step, if you have a front derailleur, this would be the time to install it. Next is the chain, and for this you're definitely going to need a chain tool. Whether it's the cheap one or the more expensive, doesn't really matter. They do the job just as fine. The chain comes coated in a sticky oil, so you might want to use a pair of gloves. Also, a piece of wire might be useful in this procedure. Highly recommend using quick links, power locks, because they're going to make your life easier. And yes, I have a full video on how to do this, but in a nutshell, put your chain on the biggest chain ring, then go to the largest cog. Do not route it through the rear mech yet. This is where you use that piece of string to get the two ends together, because you want to measure the chain to be end to end would be here. I'm gonna leave an extra 1-2 links for this hardtail, because I need the quick link here. I'm going to include that third. Once cut to the proper length, you run the chain through your rear derailleur and make sure that it doesn't touch that little tab over there. That is the correct routing. You would do this with the clutch disengaged, or in case of SRAM with the cage locked in the locked position. Finally, make sure that your power lock or quick link is fully engaged. Time to be excited, because it's the first time you can actually spin the rear wheel just by turning the cranks. Look at that. If you've done everything right, at this point the chain should stay on that 11 or 12 gear or 10 gear, and it's time to make the final adjustments for your shifting. First off, double check that the top pulley is perfectly aligned with this first cog. If not, use that high limiter screw to adjust it. Then start shifting and pay attention to noises of chain rubbing against metal. And I can hear it already. This means that my guide pulley, which is the top one, is just pushing the chain against the bigger cog over here. That's what causes the noise. We want to move that guide pulley a bit towards the smaller cog. So I'm going to rotate the barrel adjuster clockwise, about half a turn. In case you're having trouble shifting to bigger cogs, just go to that barrel adjuster and turn it counterclockwise. It means you have too much slack here on the shifter cable. If you're having trouble getting onto that biggest cog, it might mean that your derailleur is too close to the cassette, and you see that over there. In order to adjust it, you're going to use what's called the B screw or the B gap adjustment screw. As you're turning this clockwise, look at that guide pulley, how it's being pushed away from the cassette. And you want to give it enough to clear the cassette over here. You don't want to give it too much, because then you're going to start having trouble shifting down here on the smaller cogs. This is pretty important. Shimano specifies about 5-6 millimeters here between the top jockey and the biggest cog. SRAM even has a template for their eagle, just to make sure you get that right. Very last thing, double check that your low limiter screw is properly adjusted. Trim that inner cable and attach a cable end, colorful if you have, and if you use Shimano, engage the lever clutch. While you pop that beer open, give it a try through all the gears. Look at this, beautiful. And believe it or not, we're done with the drivetrain. Congratulations, you've done a great job. Time to move on to pretty much the finishing touches for this bike, but I'm going to cover that in part 4 of the video. Don't forget to subscribe. If you like this, don't forget to like the video. I'm going to put a lot of details in the description. Check them out. And until next time, I will see you folks on the trails. Cheers, guys. Cheers.